There is a peculiar kind of magic that happens when a film fails on its first attempt and succeeds anyway. Somewhere between disappointment and legend, a movie can quietly become something bigger than the industry that made it. That is the story of The Shawshank Redemption, a film that opened in theaters to empty seats, lost every single one of its 7 Academy Award nominations, and yet, decades later, sits at or near the top of nearly every greatest films ever made list a person could compile. It has spent more consecutive years as the #1 film on IMDb's user-ranked list than almost any other title in the site's history, ahead of towering classics like The Godfather and Citizen Kane. But the story of how Shawshank became Shawshank is stranger, slower, and more layered than most viewers realize. Behind the film's quiet, patient storytelling is an equally patient real-world journey. One full of near misses, studio disagreements, a token payment of $1, and a small Ohio town that would eventually rebuild its identity around a movie that almost never got made. This is a look at that journey, and at the details baked so deeply into the film that most audiences absorb them emotionally without ever consciously noticing them at all. Every great adaptation begins with a negotiation, and Shawshank's began with one of the strangest deals in modern film history. The film is based on Stephen King's 1982 novella Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, part of his collection Different Seasons. When writer-director Frank Darabont approached King about adapting it, King was intrigued but hardly convinced that Hollywood could translate something so internal, a story told mostly through narration, memory, and the slow passage of years, into a compelling film. What made the deal possible wasn't a big studio check. It was something King had been quietly doing for years, informally nicknamed his "Dollar Baby" arrangement. King would sell the film rights to short stories and novellas to promising, largely unproven filmmakers for a symbolic fee of $1, on the condition that the film not be distributed commercially without further negotiation. It was his way of giving new directors room to experiment without the commercial pressure of a 6- or 7-figure rights deal hanging over the production. Darabont, at the time known mostly for his screenwriting work and a handful of short films, was one of those filmmakers. He paid King a single dollar for the rights to the novella. That modest transaction ended up shaping the entire creative culture of the production. Because so little money was on the line for the source material itself, and because Shawshank was never treated by its studio, Columbia Pictures, as a marquee project, Darabont was given an unusual amount of creative freedom. There were no armies of executives shaping every scene. There was, instead, a filmmaker with a story he deeply believed in and just enough independence to tell it his way. It's worth sitting with how differently this could have gone. A more commercially ambitious script doctor might have compressed the story's decades-long timeline, punched up the action, or given Andy Dufresne a more conventional heroic arc. Instead, Darabont kept the deliberate pacing, the internal narration, and the quiet accumulation of small details that make the film feel less like a thriller and more like a memory being slowly unspooled. Few decisions shaped Shawshank's atmosphere more than the choice of filming location. Rather than construct a soundstage prison, the production shot primarily at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, a genuinely imposing, Gothic-style structure that had only closed its doors in 1990, a mere 4 years before filming began. The prison had a long and difficult history, having been cited for overcrowding and inhumane conditions in its final years of operation, and it sat largely abandoned and decaying by the time Darabont's crew arrived. That decision to use a real, recently operational prison rather than a built set is one of the reasons Shawshank feels so tactile. The corridors are genuinely long and echoing. The cell blocks have real texture, chipped paint, rust, decades of accumulated grime that no production designer could fully fabricate in a studio. Watching the film, there's an unmistakable sense that these walls have actually witnessed suffering, because in a very real sense, they had. The production went further than simply filming in an authentic space. Art directors reportedly aged different sections of the prison to reflect the different decades the story moves through, subtly altering wall textures and lighting so that scenes set earlier in Andy's incarceration look and feel different from scenes set closer to his escape. It's the kind of detail that almost no viewer consciously registers on a first watch, yet it contributes to the slow, cumulative sense of time passing that defines the film's emotional rhythm. The Ohio State Reformatory's decay wasn't hidden from the camera. It was incorporated into the film's visual language. Where a Hollywood set might have been built to look convincingly worn, Mansfield simply already was. That authenticity extends to something many viewers pick up on only after learning about it. The prison genuinely feels less like a filming location and more like a character with its own history, weight, and presence. Great performances are rarely built solely from the words on a page. Actors frequently construct entire interior histories for their characters. Details the audience never explicitly hears but which shape posture, tone, and the smallest choices in how a line is delivered. Shawshank is widely regarded as a masterclass in this kind of understated character work, and much of what makes Red, Andy, and Brooks feel so real comes from choices that live entirely beneath the surface of the script. Consider Red. On the page, he is a man convicted of murder decades earlier, now serving as the prison's resourceful smuggler, the man who can get you cigarettes, rock hammers, or a poster of Rita Hayworth. But the character's magnetism comes from something the film never states outright. Red carries himself like a man who once had real standing in the world outside, someone who understood commerce, favors, and leverage long before he understood prison walls. That backstory isn't spelled out in dialogue, yet it's legible in every scene where Red negotiates, assesses a situation, or reads another person's intentions before they've said a word. Andy, meanwhile, is often described by longtime fans and critics as a performance built almost entirely on restraint. There's a striking discipline to how still and controlled Andy appears for most of the film's runtime, a stiffness in his posture, a careful economy in his gestures, set against the handful of moments where something looser and more alive breaks through, playing opera over the loudspeakers, sharing a beer on the rooftop, walking into the rain after his escape with his arms outstretched. That contrast between Andy's public composure and his rare unguarded moments is one of the film's quietest but most effective storytelling tools. It tells you, without a single line of dialogue, that there are two versions of this man, the one the prison sees, and the one only the audience is allowed to glimpse. Then there's Brooks Hatlin, the elderly prison librarian whose brief but devastating storyline lands with an emotional weight far beyond its screen time. Brooks appears in only a handful of scenes, yet his arc, institutionalization, release, and the crushing inability to adapt to a world that has moved on without him, has become one of the most quoted and referenced threads in the entire film. The image of Brooks feeding birds in the park, and the note he leaves carved into a beam before his death, distill an entire tragedy of displacement into a few minutes of screen time. It's a testament to how much emotional information a film can carry in silence and small gesture, rather than dialogue. Shawshank rewards repeat viewings in a way relatively few films do, and much of that comes down to a layer of visual and structural symbolism that most audiences absorb subconsciously long before they notice it consciously. Take the framing of Andy Dufresne throughout the film. Longtime fans and film analysts have pointed out that Andy is repeatedly shot behind bars, fences, stair railings, and other physical barriers, not only in his cell, but in scenes set elsewhere in the prison, in ways that other characters simply aren't. The effect is cumulative rather than obvious. No single shot screams symbolism at the viewer. But across the length of the film, this visual pattern quietly reinforces the idea that Andy is caged in ways that go beyond his physical incarceration, caged by his wrongful conviction, by his former identity, and by the secret he's carrying for nearly 2 decades. The rooftop tarring sequence is another scene that carries more weight than it first appears to. On its surface, it's simply a moment of unexpected kindness. Andy helps a guard with a tax problem in exchange for beer for his fellow inmates. But look at what's actually happening structurally. This is the scene where Andy begins establishing himself as someone useful to the prison's financial and administrative machinery. The exact skill set that will eventually let him build the false identity, the falsified records, and the financial pipeline that make his escape and new life possible. What plays like a small, warm character moment is quietly the first domino in a plan that won't fully reveal itself for another 15 years of storytime. Even the film's most quoted line carries a structural function that's easy to miss. Get busy living, or get busy dying, isn't just a piece of memorable dialogue. It operates as the thematic spine the entire film is built around. Nearly every major character can be sorted according to that choice. Andy chooses life, relentlessly, for 19 years, even when hope seems irrational. Brooks, unable to adjust to a world that no longer needs him, ultimately chooses the opposite. The warden, whose entire identity is built on a lie he can no longer sustain once exposed, chooses it too, in his own way. Once you notice that binary running underneath the story, small character beats throughout the film, who clings to routine, who clings to hope, who simply gives up, start to read very differently. Among the film's most visually iconic details are the 3 pin-up posters that hang on Andy's cell wall across different points in the story. Rita Hayworth, then Marilyn Monroe, and finally Raquel Welch in a still from 1,000,000 years BC. Longtime fans have long noted that this isn't a random sequence of decade-appropriate pop culture references. It's also a quiet visual timeline. Rita Hayworth belongs to the era in which Andy first arrives at Shawshank, a more restrained, classically glamorous image befitting the early 1940s. Marilyn Monroe, arriving later in the story, reflects a more overtly sexualized mid-century ideal. And Raquel Welch's primal fur-clad cave woman image, appearing near the end of Andy's sentence, strips things down to something more elemental and stripped away. Watched in sequence, the posters trace not just changing decades of American pop culture, but something closer to a visual undressing, a slow shedding of layers that mirrors Andy's own transformation from a buttoned-up banker into someone preparing to walk out from underneath everything that once defined him. That symbolism pays off in the film's most famous reveal, when the poster is torn down to expose the tunnel Andy carved over nearly 2 decades. It isn't simply a clever plot mechanism. It's the final layer of that visual undressing completing itself, the last barrier between Andy's old identity and his new one coming down along with the poster itself. One of the more subtle tools in Shawshank's arsenal is its use of weather, which longtime fans and critics have pointed to as a near-constant, if quiet, emotional barometer for the story. Pay close attention across the film, and a pattern emerges. Bad things at Shawshank tend to happen under gray skies or in rain. Assaults, betrayals, and moments of institutional cruelty repeatedly occur during overcast, wet, or storm-adjacent conditions. Even Andy's escape, arguably the most triumphant moment in the film, takes place during a violent thunderstorm, nature at its most dramatic matching the tension of the sequence. But it's the very last outdoor scene of the film, the reunion between Andy and Red on a beach in Mexico, that breaks this pattern completely. It is the only scene in the entire film that unfolds under genuinely clear, bright sunshine. Every other outdoor moment carries some degree of gray cast, cloud cover, or rain. That shift isn't an accident of shooting schedules. It functions as visual punctuation, a wordless confirmation that the story has finally, fully, arrived at freedom. The sun simply doesn't come out until the very end, and by the time it does, audiences have been primed, mostly without realizing it, to feel the emotional release of that light. One of the more fascinating pieces of the film's production history involves its ending, which very nearly looked completely different from the version audiences know and love today. As the story goes, Columbia Pictures executives were concerned about the film's length and pushed to end the story earlier, on the image of Red riding a bus toward the Mexican border, hopeful but with his reunion with Andy left unseen and unconfirmed. It would have been a more ambiguous, open-ended conclusion, closer in tone to some of Stephen King's original novella, which leaves Red's journey to Zihuatanejo unresolved on the page. Darabont fought to keep the beach reunion in the film, arguing that the story wasn't ultimately about hope as an abstract idea, but about hope actually being fulfilled. Without physically showing Andy and Red reunited on that beach, the audience would be left holding the same uncertainty that torments Red throughout much of the film's back half. That final scene, widely regarded today as one of the most satisfying endings in American cinema, came dangerously close to never making the final cut. It's also worth noting how that ending reframes the entire film in retrospect. Shawshank isn't simply Andy's story, narrated by a bystander. It's a dual journey. Andy escapes physically, methodically, across nearly 2 decades of secret labor. Red's escape is internal, from institutionalization, from decades of learned hopelessness, from the belief that parole boards and prison walls define who he is. The decision to let audiences see both of those escapes completed, side by side on that beach, is a large part of why the ending resonates as powerfully as it does. The character of Brooks Hatlin occupies a relatively small amount of Stephen King's original novella, but Darabont's screenplay expands his arc considerably, turning what was a minor supporting figure into one of the emotional cornerstones of the entire film. That expansion wasn't a small creative choice. It fundamentally reshaped the story's stakes. Brooks exists in the film primarily to answer a question the story needs answered before its ending can land properly. What actually happens to a man who has spent most of his adult life inside an institution, once that institution is taken away from him? Brooks' brief, wrenching post-release storyline, his disorientation in a world that has moved on without him, his inability to find meaning in a menial job, his final message carved into a beam before his death, exists specifically to raise the stakes for Red's own eventual release. Without Brooks, Red's late film fear of the outside world, and his own crucial choice to embrace hope rather than despair, would carry far less weight. Brooks represents the version of Red's story that could have happened, had Red made a different choice. That's why, when Red arrives at the same halfway house Brooks once lived in, and adds, "So was Red," beneath Brooks' original carving, the moment lands with such force. It isn't simply a callback. It's read consciously, deliberately choosing not to repeat Brooks' fate. Warden Samuel Norton stands as one of cinema's most quietly menacing antagonists, not because he's physically threatening, but because his cruelty hides behind scripture, a tidy public image, and the language of moral righteousness. That particular flavor of villainy, corruption dressed up in piety, has long struck film historians and prison reform researchers as disturbingly grounded in real patterns of institutional abuse that have surfaced periodically throughout American penal history, where officials have exploited inmate labor, embezzled funds meant for facility improvements, and hidden behind a public reputation for moral uprightness. Whether or not any single real official directly inspired the character, Norton's specific combination of traits, a man who quotes the Bible while simultaneously using prisoners as unpaid labor for his own benefit, who launders money through a fabricated identity, and who ultimately can't survive the collapse of his own self-image once exposed, reflects patterns that have shown up again and again in documented cases of prison corruption. That grounding in something uncomfortably real is part of why Norton never quite plays as a cartoonish villain, despite how theatrically cruel some of his individual actions are. His downfall, when it comes, isn't really about the fear of prison. It's the destruction of a self-image he'd spent years constructing that he ultimately can't survive. It's easy to assume the redemption in the title refers primarily to Andy's escape and eventual vindication, the wrongfully convicted man finally set free. But longtime fans and critics alike have increasingly pointed to a broader, more layered reading of that word as it applies across the entire film. Andy's redemption isn't only about his own freedom. Throughout his 19 years at Shawshank, Andy quietly redeems pieces of the institution itself. He builds a real library out of nothing, expanding it year after year through a relentless letter-writing campaign to the state legislature. He gives Tommy Williams the chance to earn a high school equivalency diploma. He gives an entire cell block a few minutes of something resembling freedom by playing opera over the loudspeakers, even knowing it will cost him time in solitary confinement. In small, cumulative ways, Andy makes Shawshank a slightly less inhumane place, even while secretly planning to leave it behind entirely.